The floor director was shouting into his headset when Walter Beaumont, 73 years old, grabbed the edge of his podium with both hands and said, "That's the door." Not a question, not confusion. A statement, flat and certain and spoken in the voice of a man who has said something in his sleep 10,000 times and is finally saying it awake. He was pointing across the stage, not at a curtain, not at a prop, not at anything the set designers had placed there. He was pointing at the opposing family's podium, where a man named Raymond Douglas, 71 years old, had just finished describing a recurring nightmare to Steve Harvey. A nightmare about a red door, a narrow hallway, smoke filling the ceiling, a sound like the whole world cracking open, and Walter Beaumont had gone completely still at his own podium and then grabbed its edge and said those 4 words loud enough for the floor microphone to catch them, loud enough for Steve Harvey to stop mid-sentence, loud enough for the floor director to start shouting into his headset, because something was happening that was not in the production schedule, and nobody had a protocol for it. Steve Harvey turned from Raymond Douglas to Walter Beaumont and stood between them and looked at one and then the other and did not speak for 6 seconds. Then he said, quietly to both of them, "Say that again." Raymond Douglas, who had been in the middle of a story he had told versions of his whole life and had never expected to find the other half of, said, "The door is red. I've dreamed it since I was a child. Red door, narrow hallway, smoke, a sound," Walter said, "like the world cracking open." Raymond stopped. The studio fell completely silent. The 2 men looked at each other across 30 feet of stage floor, and the combined weight of 70 years and 10,000 nights of the same dream settled into the room like something that had been falling a very long time. And it finally landed. Walter Beaumont had been born on June 14, 1951, in a row house on Pershing Avenue in St. Louis, Missouri. He had been 4 months old. His mother, Iris, was 23. His father, Thomas, worked the rail yards. They had a neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who watched Walter on Tuesday evenings while Iris and Thomas went to a church supper. And on the Tuesday evening of October 9, 1951, Mrs. Aldridge had put Walter in his crib at 7:30 and gone to the kitchen to do the dishes, and the fire had started in the wall behind the stove from an electrical fault that the city inspector would identify 3 days later in a report that used the phrase "substandard post-war" wiring. Throughout the structure, the fire moved fast. Mrs. Aldridge had gotten out. The fire department had arrived in 4 minutes, fast for 1951, the incident report would note, and a firefighter named Leonard Cole had gone into the burning structure twice. The first time he had come out with Mrs. Aldridge's cat, which she had gone back for and then been unable to reach. The second time he had come out with Walter. There had been another infant in the house. The row house at 1147 Pershing Avenue was a 2-family structure. The Beaumonts occupied the first floor. The second floor was rented by a couple named James and Vivienne Douglas, who had a 4-month-old son named Raymond. Vivienne had been at the church supper with Iris. James Douglas had been home, second floor, with Raymond in his crib. And when the fire started in the first floor wall, James had come down the stairs and gone through the hallway and out the front door, and had turned around on the sidewalk and realized he did not have his son, and had tried to go back in and had been physically restrained by a neighbor. Because the hallway was fully involved by then, the ceiling was coming down, and Leonard Cole was already inside. Leonard Cole came out with Walter Beaumont. He went back in one more time. He did not come out. The incident report listed Leonard Cole as deceased. It listed both infants as recovered, Walter Beaumont to his parents, Raymond Douglas to his. What the incident report did not record, because no one had thought to record it, because it was 1951 and the relevant professional frameworks did not yet exist, was that both infants had been in the hallway simultaneously during the evacuation, that Leonard Cole had carried them both to the threshold before collapsing, that both boys had lain on the hallway floor for approximately 90 seconds in the smoke and the heat and the red-lit dark before neighbors had pulled them out. 90 seconds. 4 months old. A red door at the end of a narrow hallway, smoke filling the ceiling, a sound like the whole world cracking open. Neither family had known the other existed. They had moved away from Pershing Avenue within 6 months of the fire. The Beaumonts to Kansas City. The Douglases to Memphis. The connection between them had lived only in the incident report, in a file in a St. Louis Fire Department archive, and in the nervous systems of 2 infant boys who had grown into old men who woke at 3 a.m. 70 years later with the same image behind their eyes, and had never been able to explain where it came from. Walter had told his wife about the dream on their second date in 1974 because he had woken from it in a cold sweat in his apartment, and she had been there, and he had decided, with the particular courage of a 26-year-old who has been carrying something alone for too long, to simply say it out loud. She had listened. She had not dismissed it. She had said, "Where do you think it comes from?" He had said, "I don't know. I was in a fire as a baby. My parents told me about it. Maybe that." She had said, "Maybe." She had never stopped asking him about it. In 50 years of marriage, she had never let him file it away as simply a dream, because she said she could tell from the way he described it that it was something other than a dream, that it had the texture of memory rather than invention, that it was too specific and too consistent to be the mind making something up. Walter had seen 3 therapists over the decades. All 3 had said the same thing in different ways. Early trauma, preverbal memory, the body holding what the mind cannot access. None of them had said, "There is another man in Memphis having the same dream." Raymond Douglas had not told anyone about the dream for 30 years. He had kept it the way certain men keep things, privately, practically, in the category of experiences that are real but have no useful application, and therefore do not need to be shared. He had told his daughter Denise when she was 22 and had found him awake at 3 a.m. at the kitchen table, and she had asked, and he had described it, and she had said, "How long?" He had said, "As long as I can remember." She had said, "What does the door look like?" He had said, "Red. Always red." She had looked at him for a moment. She had said, "Grandpa says the fire took everything. But here you are." Raymond had not known what to do with that sentence. He had put it in the category with the dream, real, specific, without useful application, and he had gone back to bed. Denise had submitted the Family Feud application. She had not told Raymond she was doing it. She had done it the way Priya had submitted Darius's application, and the way Vanessa had contacted the production team for Raymond Reeves, because sometimes the people who love us can see the thing we need from the outside when we are too close to it to see it ourselves. And Denise Douglas had decided that her father needed to be in a room where something unexpected could happen to him, because she had a feeling, without evidence, that he was owed one. She had not known about Walter Beaumont. No one had known about Walter Beaumont. The production team had not known about Walter Beaumont. His family had applied independently, 6 weeks after the Douglases, and the research team had done their standard background work and found the 1951 fire in a digitized archive of St. Louis Fire Department records and had flagged it as a biographical detail and had moved on. Because they were looking for reunion stories and personal histories, and the record said both infants recovered, and there was no obvious connection to anyone else on the upcoming roster. The connection had surfaced at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, 4 days before the taping, when a production assistant named Lily was cross-referencing background files and saw the address, 1147 Pershing Avenue, appear in both families' records, Walter Beaumont's and Raymond Douglas's, in the same incident report, on the same date, in the same paragraph. She had read it twice. She had printed it. She had walked to the story producer's office and set it on the desk and said, "I think you need to look at this." The story producer had looked at it for a long time. Then she had called the executive producer. The executive producer had called legal. Legal had called the research team. The research team had spent 4 days verifying, cross-referencing birth records, fire department archives, hospital records from St. Louis Children's Hospital, a 1952 newspaper article about Leonard Cole that mentioned both families by name in the second paragraph. By Thursday evening, the verification was complete. By Friday morning, the production team had made a decision that the story producer later described as the easiest decision she had made in 14 years of television: put both families on the same taping and let the show find it. They had not told either family. They had not told Steve Harvey. They had put the incident report in Steve's research packet with a note that said, "These two families were in the same fire in 1951. They don't know each other. They don't know this. See where it goes." Steve Harvey had read that note in his dressing room on Thursday morning and had sat very still for a while. And that wasn't even the part that made Steve cry. The taping had run normally for the first round and a half. Both families were warm and funny, and the audience liked both of them. Steve had been watching for the moment. He knew it was in the room somewhere, knew it was in the research packet, knew that at some point the shape of the day was going to change. And he had been patient, because he had learned in 22 years that these things arrived in their own time, and the host's job was not to force them, but to be ready. Raymond had been doing a contestant chat about the fire. Not the dream, the fire. The factual biographical event. The thing his family had always known. He had said, "My father used to tell us about a fire when I was a baby. Said a firefighter carried me out. Said the man didn't make it." Steve had said, "How did that shape you?" Raymond had said, "I think about that man every day of my life. I don't know his name. My father never found out his name." Steve had looked at his research packet. He had looked at Raymond. He had said his name was Leonard Cole. Raymond had gone very still. Steve had said, "He went in 3 times. He got you out on the 3rd pass." His name is in the incident report from October 9th, 1951. Raymond Douglas had put both hands flat on the podium and looked at the stage floor and said, "Leonard Cole." Testing the weight of it, the name the man had carried for 70 years without knowing. And then Steve had said, "Tell me something else about that night." And Raymond had said, "I have this dream." And he had described it. And Walter Beaumont, at the opposing podium, had grabbed the edge of his podium with both hands and said, "That's the door." Steve stood between them. He said, "Walter, tell me the dream." Walter said, "Red door at the end of a narrow hallway. Smoke coming down from the ceiling. A sound like the whole world cracking open. I wake up at 3 in the morning. I've had it since I can remember." Steve looked at Raymond. Raymond was looking at Walter with the expression of a man who has just heard his own internal frequency played back to him from an external source for the first time. Steve said, "Raymond, same dream?" Raymond said, "Exactly the same." Steve said, "How long?" They answered simultaneously, "As long as I can remember." The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey reached into the research packet he had carried to center stage. He took out the incident report, the actual document, printed from the digitized archive, 2 pages, dated October 9th, 1951. He held it up. He said, 1147 Pershing Avenue, St. Louis, Missouri, October 9th, 1951. Structure fire, electrical origin. 2 infants recovered from the hallway. He looked at Walter. Walter Thomas Beaumont, 4 months old, 1st floor. He looked at Raymond. Raymond James Douglas, 4 months old, 2nd floor. He looked at both of them. You were in the same hallway, both of you, for 90 seconds, in the smoke and the heat and the dark. 4 months old. He paused. You have been dreaming the same 90 seconds for 70 years. Walter Beaumont let go of the podium. His hands came up to his face. Raymond Douglas sat down on the stage floor, not collapsed, sat down deliberately, the same way Steve had sat on the stage steps in Script 2, because the floor was the most honest place to be. His daughter Denise, at the family podium, had her hand over her mouth. Walter's wife Patricia was gripping their son Marcus's arm. The audience was on its feet, and the sound they made was not the window in summer sound this time. It was quieter, more interior. The sound of 220 people individually processing the same impossible thing and arriving, separately, at the same place. Steve Harvey stood at center stage and looked at the incident report in his hand and then at the 2 men, one standing, one on the floor, both 70 years removed from a hallway they had never been able to leave, and he said, "Come here." Not to one of them, to both of them. He said it to the space between them. Walter crossed the stage. He moved slowly, the way you move when your legs are not entirely sure the ground is stable, and he stopped at the edge of the center mark and looked down at Raymond on the floor. And Raymond looked up at him. And Walter reached down and Raymond took his hand, and Walter helped him up. And the 2 men stood face to face on the Family Feud stage, 71 and 73 years old, and looked at each other with the specific quality of people who are seeing, for the first time, the only other person alive who knows exactly what a particular darkness felt like. Raymond said, "The door." Walter said, "Was always red." They said it together, not planned, not performed, the same sentence, the same cadence. The way people finish each other's sentences when they have been living in the same room for 70 years without knowing it. The crew was crying. The camera operator on the left dolly had stopped. The boom operator held still. The floor director had both hands over his mouth. The production assistant Lily, who had found the connection in the cross-reference files 4 days ago and had printed the incident report and walked to the producer's office and changed the shape of this taping, was standing in the back of the studio with her back against the wall and tears running down both cheeks, and she would say later in an interview that she had never felt more certain. That she was supposed to be somewhere than she felt in that moment, standing against that wall, watching 2 old men hold each other's hands on a stage she had helped put them on. Steve Harvey stood 3 feet away and did not speak for a long time. When he did speak, he said, "Let me tell you something." He said it to the men, and the room, and the camera. I was at a gas station years ago with nothing. I mean genuinely nothing, no floor, no ceiling, no wall I could put my back against. And a stranger looked at me and said, "God's got a plan bigger than your pain." And what I took from that, what I have carried from that for 30 years, is not just the comfort, it's the precision. God's plan is bigger, not different, not separate, bigger. It contains the thing that hurt you. It was always going to contain this. He looked at Walter and Raymond. You were in the same hallway. You have been in the same dream. And today you are on the same stage. That is not coincidence. That is a plan so large neither of you could see the shape of it from inside it. He looked into the camera. Everyone watching at home right now who has been carrying something they cannot explain, a dream, a fear, a memory that doesn't match the life they know they lived. I want you to hear this. Walter Beaumont and Raymond Douglas spent 70 years thinking they were alone in a hallway. They were never alone in that hallway, not for 1 second of 70 years. He paused. You are not alone in your hallway either. The studio fell completely silent. Then Steve turned to his producers and said, "Get me the fire chief's grandson." The floor producer touched his earpiece. The story producer had anticipated this, had included the contact information in the research packet with a note. His name was Leonard Cole III. He was 44 years old. His grandfather, Leonard Cole, had died in the 1147 Pershing Avenue fire in 1951. His father had inherited the original incident report, a personal copy Leonard Cole had made before his last shift, for reasons nobody had ever understood, as if some part of him had known the document would need to exist beyond the official record. Leonard Cole III had inherited it from his father in 2009 and had spent 11 years trying to find the families, posting in genealogy forums and St. Louis Historical Society groups, and sending letters to addresses that were decades out of date. He answered on the first ring. Steve said, "Leonard, my name is Steve Harvey. I have both families here." A silence. Then Leonard Cole III said, "Both of them?" Steve said, "In the same room. Right now." Another silence, longer. Then Leonard said, "My grandfather saved them both." Steve said, "He did." Leonard said, "I've been trying to find them for 11 years. Steve said, "I know. They'd been looking for him for 70. He held the phone between Walter and Raymond. Walter said, "Your grandfather carried us out of that hallway." Leonard said, "Yes, sir." Raymond said, "We didn't know his name until today." Leonard said, "He knew yours. He wrote them in the report himself. He wrote both your names. Walter Beaumont, Raymond Douglas. He made sure somebody wrote them down." A silence. Then Walter said, in a voice that was very quiet and very steady, "He made sure we were real." Leonard said, "Yes, sir. That's exactly what he did." The floor director had stopped giving directions entirely. The control booth had stopped cutting between cameras and just held on the widest shot, because the director said later there was nothing to direct. There was only something to witness. And the job of the camera was simply to hold still and let the thing be seen. But Steve wasn't done. He turned to the audience and said, "I want to do something we have never done on this stage." He turned to both families. He said, "I want you to draw it. Right now. Both of you. Separate pieces of paper. Draw what you see in the dream." A production assistant produced paper and pens within 60 seconds. 2 sheets, 2 pens, handed to Walter and Raymond at center stage. Neither man looked at the other's paper. They both drew. It took about 90 seconds. Walter drew first, a rectangle, a door frame. The door filled in with heavy strokes, the linework of a man who had been seeing it for 70 years and knew every edge. Raymond drew second, the same rectangle, the same door frame, the same heavy fill, the same particular angle of the light coming through the gap at the bottom, where the fire was on the other side. Steve took both papers. He held them side by side at center stage. They were not identical in the way of photocopies. They were identical in the way of two people describing the same truth in their own hand. The same shape from two separate minds that had never compared notes. The audience saw them and made a sound that had no name. Denise Douglas put both hands on the podium and said, "To no one, to everyone. Grandpa says the fire took everything, but here you are. She had not planned to say it on stage. It came out because it was the truest thing available, and the room needed the truest thing available. Steve Harvey looked at the two drawings in his hands. He looked at the two men in front of him. He said, the door was always red. He said it the way they had said it, as a fact, as a confirmation, as the sentence that closes a 70-year question. Then he set the drawings side by side on the podium edge, carefully, the way you set down something that needs to be seen. Both families won. The opposing family structure had dissolved somewhere around the moment Walter crossed the stage, and by the end both sets of families were standing in one group at center stage. And the production team confirmed both wins in a statement they released before the episode even aired, because the story was already everywhere. Leonard Cole III had posted about the call on a genealogy forum at 9:17 that evening, and by morning the post had 40,000 responses. The clip was uploaded on a Friday night. By Sunday, it had 88 million views. By the following Friday, 320 million. Within a month, 480 million views across all platforms, the second highest total in the show's history. The hashtag #TheRedDoor trended globally for 13 consecutive days. Trauma researchers, neuroscientists specializing in preverbal memory, and historians of the 1950s St. Louis housing crisis all cited the clip within 90 days. 3 peer-reviewed papers on preverbal trauma and shared environmental memory referenced the case within 6 months. Leonard Cole III was interviewed in 22 publications. In every interview he said the same thing: "My grandfather made sure they were real. That's all I wanted people to know." The Red Door Foundation, incorporated in Missouri and Tennessee jointly 58 days after the taping, focused on connecting survivors of shared early childhood trauma, fires, disasters, institutional placements, who had been separated and had no framework for understanding why certain memories or dreams felt borrowed from a life they couldn't place. In its first year, the foundation processed 2,100 inquiries, facilitated 340 survivor connections, and partnered with 4 university trauma research centers to study preverbal shared memory. Walter and Raymond both joined the board. They met in person for the first time outside the studio in St. Louis, on Pershing Avenue, where 1147 had once stood and was now a parking lot. And they stood on the asphalt together and looked at the space where the hallway had been and did not say much. Because they had spent 70 years in that hallway already, and they knew every inch of it, and standing there in the daylight was not about seeing it again, but about finally seeing it together. Walter's granddaughter, who had come to St. Louis for the visit, took a photograph of the 2 men standing on the parking lot. They were side by side, shoulders almost touching, looking at the same point in the empty air where a red door had once been. She posted it that evening. It was shared 3.1 million times. The caption she wrote was 4 words: "They found each other." Raymond and Walter spoke on the phone every Sunday after that. Not every day. They were old men with full lives and grandchildren and the particular economy of energy that comes with being in your 70s. But every Sunday, in the morning, before the day got complicated, they talked about their families and their weeks, and the things old men talk about when they have earned the right to talk about whatever they want. Sometimes, at the end of the call, one of them would say, "Any dreams this week?" And the other would say yes or no. And if yes, they would describe it. And over the months the descriptions changed. The hallway was still there. The smoke was still there. But the door, both of them reported, had started to look different. Less like a wall of red. More like a threshold. more like the beginning of something rather than the end. Walter told his wife Patricia about the change. She had been waiting 50 years for it. She said, "What does it look like now?" He said, "Like a door you can go through." She said, "Are you going through it?" He said, "Not yet." He paused. "But I'm not afraid of it anymore." She took his hand. She had been taking his hand for 50 years. She took it now the same way she always had, completely, without reservation, and she said, "That's enough. That's everything." Some dreams are not the mind making things up. Some dreams are the body's archive, holding what happened before language arrived to describe it, before memory had a framework to contain it, storing it the way amber stores a thing, perfectly, privately, indefinitely, until the day the right conditions arrive and the thing inside becomes visible. Walter Beaumont and Raymond Douglas carried the same 90 seconds in amber for 70 years. They carried it through marriages and children and grandchildren and careers and kitchens, and 3 in the morning wake-ups and therapists who said preferable trauma and Sunday mornings and all the ordinary texture of 2 full lives lived in complete ignorance of each other. And on a Thursday afternoon, in a television studio in Los Angeles, a production assistant named Lily found a cross-reference in a digitized archive, and Steve Harvey read a research note, and Raymond Douglas described a dream. And Walter Beaumont said, "That's the door." And 70 years of amber cracked open, and the thing inside was exactly what it had always been. 2 small boys in a smoke-filled hallway, not alone. Never alone, waiting for a door that was always going to open. Subscribe right now and hit the bell. Every week, there is a story this close to staying lost. Leave a comment. Have you ever had a dream so specific and so consistent that you knew it wasn't invented? Tell us about it. Share this today with someone who needs to know their hallway is not empty. The Red Door Foundation link is in the description.